Hey, everybody. Big thank you to, obviously, the team who helped make this happen, and then also to the amazing set of sponsors that we have who have helped to put this on and have also been very understanding as we've had a large number of changes. So for those of you who have been here in the past to one of these events, or for those of you who haven't, I've started them all the same way, which is that today is for questions. And you know, my feeling when we started this 3 years ago is the same really as my feeling today, which is that we have a lot more questions than we have answers around this stuff, and that this is a space to explore those questions, to not be certain about them, to not have to pretend you're certain about them when someone asks you about them. So I really wanted to create an environment where everybody felt good about asking those questions and about talking about AI and what's possible within marketing. The one place where we don't do questions is after sessions. So it's a pretty rapid fire day. We have lots of time to hang out together. For the first time ever, we're actually gonna do drinks afterwards in the same place. So everybody is welcome to join us on the 16th floor at 5:30 after we finish up for a couple hours of drinks. But we won't be doing Q&A. Mostly that's to avoid the sort of person who stands up and does the 5-minute soliloquy that they pretend has a question mark at the end, but didn't actually have a question mark at the end. And then finally, you know, I put these programming tenets together after the first event we did. And they've really sort of been the thing I've tried to guide all of the decisions about who comes up and speaks and the kinds of things we present. So, you know, the day is really focused on doers over speculators, curiosity over confidence, conversations over panels. That one is particularly important to me. I hate panels at conferences. Anybody who's ever talked to me knows that. So we do have a couple amazing conversations today, but they're one-on-one conversations, so you actually get to hear from the person. Show over tell, and then finally process over perfection. So just to get started, I have this sort of particular process that I do for writing a talk like this, which is that I sort of, well, I try to start it like a month out, but usually I start it like 2 weeks out, and I sit down and I try to actually write the entire thing as a long essay. And then I sort of adapt it and evolve it. And the really nice thing about doing that, though, is that you have this sort of history. I have this history of kind of my thoughts around marketing and AI over the last 3 years. And as part of putting this together, it was sort of fun to look back at kind of this journey. You know, when we think about where we are, really, it's kind of amazing how early it is in this adoption of AI. So, you know, we started the conference 3 years ago. You know, where exactly you put sort of the beginning of this, whether it's when ChatGPT came out, which was basically right after we started the conference, or it's when the API for GPT-3 went GA. But, you know, it's kind of amazing to look at. As much as has changed, I actually think like a lot has stayed fairly constant. And also just to put it in perspective, where year 3 looks like. So this is what year 3 looked like for mobile. So year 3 in mobile was the first 4G iPhone. It was 10 billion downloads in the App Store. $1 billion went out to developers. It was the year that Instagram, Netflix, and Find My iPhone made it on. So it's like, I think it's good to keep these things in perspective as we think about kind of where we're at. I think that one of the big themes for today, and it's actually the password for the Wi-Fi, is it is early. I think we're just early in this journey. So, you know, going back and looking over those talks, I really had these sort of 4 kind of strings that I feel really good I've been saying for the last 3 years. First one is that it's early. The second one is that hands-on is really the only way to get a feel for this stuff. This is a fundamentally counterintuitive technology. It's new, it's different, and I think the only way you can really get to understand it is to get your hands on a keyboard and actually play with it. You can't trust anybody who sounds too confident. There's a tweet from a couple years ago that I kind of constantly reference, which is somebody said, the thing about playing with AI and keeping up with this world is not so much that you gain this magical foresight for the future, it's that you get really good at detecting everybody else's bullshit. And I continue to believe that. I think that anybody who confidently asserts where we're gonna be in 6 months or 12 months or 2 years or 5 years is absolutely lying to you. And you should approach any of that with deep skepticism, including from me, if you hear it. And then finally, AI is much more of a mirror than it is a crystal ball. And this one is one that I've sort of been kind of thinking about for a while. One of the very first things I did when I got my hands on the DALL-E API, DALL-E 2 API and GPT-3, was I built this collabs experiment. So you could take two brands and you could smash them together and it would build these sort of cute little brand collabs. It was of a moment, 2022. And the thing that really struck me, and it's actually the thing that sort of made me do all of this, was that what I found was that good brands made better images. And that sounds like kind of trite at first, like of course good brands made better images, but when you think that these models start from nothing, they have no understanding of the world, that they still came to the same conclusions about what good brands are that I had. And ultimately, I think that comes down to, good brands are built on consistency and distinctiveness, and that's kind of how these models get trained, right? They sort of find those patterns, and so the stronger those patterns are, the better they're reflected back in the models. The sort of flip side of that was I built a manifesto generator just as a fun game with a creative director friend of mine a couple years ago. And it was just fun and interesting. And one of the bits of feedback that was negative I got was that, isn't it kind of sad that like we're gonna let AI write these manifestos and that these important brand documents should be given up to the AI? And my feedback to that point was just, hey, this only works because everybody writes the same manifesto. If every manifesto didn't sound exactly the same to begin with, if you weren't already the AI, then it never would have worked to begin with, right? And so, I think we have to turn it back on ourselves. Marshall McLuhan in Understanding Media, Marshall McLuhan is a favorite thinker of mine, and Understanding Media is a favorite book of mine. He actually talks about the Narcissus myth, and he talks about how it's frequently misinterpreted, that we all think of Narcissus as this sort of person who fell in love with himself, but actually Narcissus looks in the water and doesn't recognize himself. And the root of the word Narcissus is the same as the root of the word narcotic. It's numb, right? So he was numb to his own reflection. And I think that's kind of us, right? Like we don't see ourselves in this thing immediately. We complain that it's too bureaucratic or it sounds too corporate, and we don't realize that's what we sound like. Now, obviously, this is not our whole selves, right? Like, this is a representation of us as we exist on the internet, mostly. So these models are trained on a corpus largely based on a thing called the Common Crawl. And so when the Washington Post went and looked at C4, which is a subset of the Common Crawl, it's a sort of clean subset, what they found was that the number one source of tokens in C4 was patents.google.com. And if any of you have ever read a patent application, you will know that they are the most excruciating way to describe anything that exists on the planet. So this is an office chair comprising a seat and a backrest, wherein the backrest includes a lumbar support, which is adjustable between and inactive positions in which it follows the general shape of the backrest, and a fully active position in which it is curved outwards forwardly from the backrest in order to support the lumbar back portion of a person seated on the seat of the chair. Or when I asked AI to find me an even more ridiculous one, it found me a stick. This is a more recent patent application for a stick, which is an apparatus for use as a toy by an animal, for example, a dog, to either fetch or carry, chew. Includes a main section with at least one protrusion extending therefrom that resembles a branch in appearance. So this is what we train these models on. We train them on text like that. That's the single biggest set of tokens that exists in C4, which is this subset of Common Crawl. So we are Narcissus, and we're staring into the water, and we're seeing reflected back to us an office chair. But where did we learn this? Like, how did we come to be so bureaucratic? At my conference in February in LA, I talked about this amazing document, which is called the Simple Sabotage Field Manual. So the Office of Strategic Services was the precursor to the CIA, and they produced this document in 1944 as a way to encourage citizen saboteurs to quietly sabotage Nazi operations. So it was like, pass it out in France and encourage people to slow down the Nazis in whatever they were doing. And so, it sort of is a guide for these people to do this without getting themselves killed. It says that the sort of citizen saboteur, their weapons are salt and nails and candy, Or if you're a janitor, one of the things you should do is that you should leave a bucket of oily waste in the corner, because that might catch fire. And if it doesn't happen to catch fire, you can always throw a cigarette in there to make sure that it does catch fire. So anything to kind of slow it down. But the part that is like most amazing about this document is towards the end, when it switches from how to sabotage sort of blue-collar operations, right? There's a famous story about Citroën, the French car manufacturer, actually changing the line by like a few millimeters on where to fill the oil in one of their trucks, so that the Nazi trucks would break down more quickly because they would underfill the oil and it would run out. But this white-collar portion is really a sort of extraordinary document, because it basically tells us how to operate in modern corporations. Insist on doing everything through channels. When possible, refer all things to committees. Bring up irrelevant issues as frequently as possible. Revisit previously made decisions. Or maybe my favorite is advocate caution. So anybody who wants to move too fast, make sure you tell them that they should slow down, lest you become embarrassed by the decisions that you made. So this is literally a manual produced by the United States with instructions on how to sabotage organizations. It's a fairly extraordinary document. So after the conference in February, somehow I had this epiphany that because this was a document produced by the government, that it was in the public domain. And so all of you hopefully have received a copy. Some of you are holding it, I see. We hired a designer. I wrote a foreword for it, and we have republished this document in beautiful form. So you can all carry it with you and sabotage your own companies that way. Or at least you can hand it to folks you know, and have a shared vocabulary for this kind of sabotage that happens. Because I think, those of us in this room, we're pretty focused on sort of moving things forward and probably moving slightly faster than our companies are always comfortable with. And building a shared vocabulary for how to deal with that, I think, is really critical. So that's our gift to you. Really, really hope you enjoy it. Give it a read. We may put it up on Amazon at some point, but have fun. So here we are Narcissus. We're staring into the water, and we see reflected back to us an org chart. So we fast forward ourselves to 2025. I'm sure all of you saw this document, or you saw this headline. This is this MIT study that came out, I think, about a month ago, that said 95% of AI pilots fail. Lots of people picked it up. It became a big thing. It's got sort of fairly questionable methodology. I don't know how you actually sort of calculate any of these things. But actually, having read the document, I think fundamentally the point of it is the point I made at the beginning. It's just early. Right? It's really, really early in this process. Like we are in year 3 of what is probably a 10 or 15 year journey. One of the things I said when we did the first version of this that I still fundamentally believe is, if the models never got better than they were then, that was GPT-4, I thought we still have 10 years of runway to bring these into organizations and change the ways of working. Of course, they have gotten significantly better, and we still have 10 years at least to change the way we work. There's this great idea in computer science called explore exploit. So it's a way you deal with problems when the problem essentially requires that you would have to try every permutation. So sort of a thing we do every day that deals with this is using Google Maps for directions. So technically, if you wanted to find the most optimal path between A and B using streets, the only way to find the perfect optimal path would be to try every single path. And so obviously you can't have Google Maps try every single path. And so what Google Maps does is it spends some amount of time at the beginning searching the sort of possible optimal paths, and then it sort of settles into one. And then it sort of optimizes you from there, right? Because basically, you come to realize that there's a point of diminishing returns where you could keep searching forever and you would only get a 1% more efficient path to the place that you're going. And so that's the explore-exploit trade-off, right? You sort of have to do a wide search of spaces in explore, and you do this sort of narrow optimization in exploit. And I think this is sort of also a perfect way to think about how companies work, right? There's multiple trillion-dollar companies represented in this room. A trillion-dollar company is very much in exploit mode, right? Like a trillion-dollar company has developed a business model that works really, 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 really well. And the whole existence of the organization is about how do you protect and drive the value of that investment, right? Like everybody wishes they had that. And there's something wrong with that. In fact, like, you know, I mean, who am I to say that a trillion-dollar company is sort of doesn't understand how to operate its business? That is an amazing, amazing organization. These are some of the greatest companies in the history of the world, right? But they are very much in exploit. And I think part of the feeling that we get when, you know, as practitioners who are trying to push AI inside enterprises is we push up against that, right? The company is built to optimize. It's not really built for the exploration. It's not built for searching over many permutations and trying different things and making those kinds of decisions. And so I think a lot of what we feel in AI and elsewhere in this moment is that, right? Which is like we're pushing up against the organization which is set up to do something different than the thing that we are trying to do. When you look at the actual sort of quotes in the document, you know, it basically says this. It says, most of these fail due to brittle workflows, lack of contextual learning, and misalignment with day-to-day operations, right? They're falling over because they don't actually recognize how the organization functions. They are trying to build for this sort of perfect existence. One of the other patterns I see here, this is the SAE levels of autonomy. So in self-driving cars, you have these levels of autonomy. Tesla, as an example, is a level 2 autonomy vehicle. So that means that while it can do lots of amazing things, you as a human are still ultimately liable for what it does, right? So if it gets into an accident, you are liable. Waymo famously is level 4. So you get into a Waymo, you sit in the back seat, you are not liable for anything that Waymo does, right? And I think one of the things that's happening inside organizations right now is that you try to build this perfect demo, right? The perfect sort of AI demo. And it's like this perfect level 4 demo, no people are gonna touch it. And then it runs into the sort of messy reality that is the organization, and it all falls apart, right? I mean, the reality is that I actually haven't met any large companies that don't have policies that say that as marketers, you have to review all content AI produces before it goes out the door. Like, this is just the reality of the situation we're in. So why are we doing level 4 when we should be focusing on level 2? So, you know, it's like we just got to stop trying to build for perfection, and we just got to build for reality, right? This is where we are. I watch a lot of YouTube with my kids, and I've talked about this in the past. It's a thing we do every night, but I find a lot of inspiration from it. One of them is this science channel called Veritasium, and they had this sort of perfect analogy, I thought, for this, and so I wanted to include it in the presentation. It's about how superglue works.
Superglue in the tube is a liquid of identical monomer molecules. The molecule is ethyl cyanoacrylate. When you put it between two surfaces, the liquid flows into all the pores and crevices. Then the monomers start reacting with each other, joining to form long polymer chains. This turns the glue from a liquid into a solid. And at this point, it can no longer be pulled out of the cracks and crevices, so it's stuck in place, and the two surfaces are connected. If you're ever trying to glue surfaces that are too smooth, this is probably the reason superglue sticks poorly. There are few crevices or pores for it to cling to. To fix this, you can sand the surfaces to introduce some surface texture. That way, when the liquid glue solidifies, it's stuck in the cracks.
I just kind of love this as an analogy, which is like we're trying to kind of build these pilots and these demos on this perfectly smooth surface. Like, what if our companies actually operated that way? Instead of the reality, which is much messier, but it's actually the thing that we need. This is my nooks and crannies theory of AI, which is that, like, you need all those nooks and crannies to make it actually work. And it sort of really comes out in this sort of ways of working. So, you know, to me, the kind of holy trinity of being successful in these AI programs is AI, which sort of represents kind of unmetered intelligence, code, which allows you to build workflows, and then expertise, which is all the sort of thinking and ideas and documents and all of these things that exist inside the organization that make the organization actually work. And that stuff that's at the bottom, you can't do it without that. It's not interesting anymore. It's just a demo. It's gonna be one of the 95% that fail. in essence, we have to build for what's on the left, not for the one on the right. There's actually this theory from the 70s, an organizational theory called the garbage can theory of organizations. And the garbage can theory basically says, rather than this, the sort of perfect org chart, the way organizations actually work is we put a bunch of people and problems and money and all these things into a big garbage can, and we mix it up, and what we get out is sort of randomly assorted groupings that solve really hard problems really amazingly well. And so it's not that this is like a problematic thing or we need to fix it. This is just the reality of how we function. In urban planning, we call these desire paths, right? They're these sort of lines that develop when people walk over a path. So bureaucracy, I think, interestingly, in a way, is the substrate that we need to make these things work. Like we don't want to ignore it. We actually want to sort of build into it. Like we don't want to pretend that we don't need approvals by all of these people along the way. We just need to think about that. We need to build systems in different kinds of ways. And when you're building an agent to write copy, you need to think about where in that process people are going to need to intercede, because people need to intercede, and that's fine. That's where you are. All of this works because these models that were introduced in 2017 called transformers were built on this thing called self-attention. And this is sort of as deep as I'll go technically. I've tried not to go too deep. I did this sort of illustrative attention diagram, but it was this kind of amazing idea where it's called self-attention. And so essentially every time you input into the model, you ask it a question, like in this case, why is AI a mirror, not a crystal ball? What it does is it takes all the words from that input and it compares it to all the other words in that input, and it compares each one to each other. And it looks at them not based on the order that you put them in or anything else. It runs it through a bunch of sort of specialized systems that basically say, what should attend to what else? So basically, which connections are most important? And so in a way, I think it's sort of very representative of those desire paths. Like it finds the reality of the connections, not the ones that we say. This is sort of what it's able to understand. And what's amazing about that is that it means it's the first kind of software system that can understand that messy reality, right? Like all of these other input methods we've had for computers over the last 100 years have been based on being very orderly, right? Like it literally starts with punch cards, and then we have terminals, and then we have GUIs, and you always have to click on a thing. And I really do think this is sort of this amazing moment where we can have these messy inputs and messy outputs, and it can make sense of any of them. Andre Karpathy, who ran AI at Tesla for a while and was one of the first engineers at OpenAI, he calls it software 3.0. So basically, if you're trying to solve a problem in software 1.0, like doing sentiment analysis, you'd write a bunch of code and it would run it and you would do the sentiment analysis. The software 2.0 was these neural nets, so you'd take a ton of examples and you'd train your own neural net to do sentiment analysis. And then in example 3, you can just write a prompt, and we can all ask ChatGPT. We could open our phone right now, and we can do sentiment analysis. Obviously, the amazing difference between those 3 things is 1 and 2, you definitely had to be an engineer, and 3, you definitely do not. And that's, I think, the moment that we're all dealing with. But it's also that it makes it so we can interpret a whole new kind of data, right? We move from being able to need very structured data all the time to being able to take in qualitative and creative information and be able to process that, which means we can open up a whole new world of problems. So this is a screenshot, basically, of a text thread I had with James, who's my co-founder of Percolate, co-founder of Alephic. After I was working on a project with EY a little over a year ago, they're going to talk about it a little later, and I had this sort of realization that I was using code and AI to do something that would have taken 20 people over multiple months to do. And that was sort of a mind-blowing thing. And the mind-blowing thing wasn't so much that like AI was replacing SAS, it was that like this is a whole new world of software that we can start to build, that like it just wasn't a place that software could touch before. And so I think that that's kind of the thing I've been going over and over in my head, is that I think this moment, what's so incredible about it is that we have this, we can turn anything into software, right? It's not about adding AI to software, though there's a lot of that happening as well, and we've seen plenty of it, but it's about turning anything, any process into software, right? Like turning this sort of very qualitative, and what we do as marketers, it tends to be pretty qualitative and pretty creative. And the opportunity to apply these software development principles to these kinds of problems, I think is a really amazing thing. Just as a kind of small example of this, the way I talked at the beginning about writing my presentation. So I use this note-taking system called Obsidian. You write a bunch of markdown notes. And now I use it with Claude Code. And so I'm able to sort of do all of this writing and all of this work, and then I'm able to save it, use tools like Git, and I can see the whole history, and I can watch that whole presentation get written. Or like even more mind-blowing and incredibly, and I had to add this like yesterday because it was such a good example, is so what I do when I'm writing the presentation is I basically go back and forth. So I start in this script, and then you go to slides, and naturally when you take a written essay and you turn it into slides, you need to change a bunch of stuff because there's things you can get away with, like just adding a heading to change things. That's a little harder to get away with when you're actually talking to 200 people. And so what I had to do is I downloaded the PDF, and then I had it split all the images out. I had it run every image through AI, and then I had it take my script, and I had it put all the images into the script and rework the ordering of the script based on the ordering I had actually put into the images, right? So then I could sort of review it and refine it, and I could also send it over to ChatGPT and Claude to get feedback on it, because in addition to each image, I had it describe what was in the image. So it could read the script as a whole, it could read the talk as a whole, and give me specific feedback on the places that I needed to work on it. So, I think in one way this moment is amazing because anyone can code, but I think even more amazing is that anything can be code, right? And that's like that's awesome, I think. I mean, it's scary, it's different, but I think it's pretty amazing. So, I think in essence, this is sort of my theme for the day, which is that AI isn't so much a software feature as it is this missing interface between marketing and computing. And it lets us start to think about new ways of doing our jobs and our tasks and all the things that we might want to do. So I said a lot. I'm going to attempt to wrap this up fairly quickly. Some of these wrap-ups also are more general thoughts. Four kind of 5 big things. One is just leaders have to be in the trenches. This is a huge one. I think that, those of you here, you largely are in the trenches, but I think, one of the things I said at the beginning is you've got to be hands-on keyboards to really get this. I think leaders especially have to be hands-on keyboard to get this. There's this great quote from Andy Grove in Only the Paranoid Survive, where he basically says that in an inflection point, you sort of got to throw everything away and you've got to let chaos reign. And I think that's really kind of what's going on here. Bureaucracy is the substrate, right? Like, I think obviously we have to push against it. We're pushing to build. I think those of us in the room are builders, but we don't want to ignore the bureaucracy because we need that to grip into the organization to build things that are actually useful. And when you think about what those are, ways of working, documentation, all the sort of amazing thoughts that exist in the heads of people. Start with tools, not orchestrators. So, agents is a thing that comes up in every single meeting that I ever go to now. And I think there's a sort of very simple thing to understand about agents is that, when you actually look at how they're built, like you look at something like LangChain or you look at AWS Strands, what you see is this sort of model for how they work. And I think we need to kind of reflect that model in the way that we think about it, which is at the bottom you have these tokens, right? Your sort of both the public tokens, the things that the model's been trained on, and your private tokens, all the documentations and expertise that you have. And then you have tools, and tools are these sort of little bits and pieces. They're little things that do something very narrow. Search the web, go grab a web page back, do all these little things. Agents ultimately are sort of groups of tools, and orchestrators are groups of agents. And the key is you got to start from the bottom up, not the top down. I think too many organizations who fall over that 95%, you start from the top. You try to build the whole thing. You try to eat the whole animal at once instead of breaking it into pieces. Build level 2, not level 4. I talked about this, but I think just building for reality over perfection. And then finally, it's 1% inspiration, 99% perspiration. So, at the end of the day, as much as this is a technical problem, it's a change management problem. This is my favorite change management framework. I hope you all have a favorite change management framework as well. But this comes from education in the early 90s. And, I think it's a really amazing way to think about how you drive change. And the point of it is that if you're missing any one of these pieces, what you get on the other end is, confusion and false starts. So finally, returning to the sort of 4+1 truths. It's early. I think that's still very true. Hands-on is the only way. I think hopefully you are all hands-on in this room. If you're here, that's probably why you're here. But we've got to encourage others, especially the leaders in the organizations, to also be hands-on. I think that's really critical. Don't trust anyone who sounds too confident, including myself or anybody else who shows up on this stage. AI is a mirror, not a crystal ball. And then finally, the last one is just stop apologizing. So we gave away these bracelets. It started as a joke on our Slack. And basically, it says WWGPDD. And we would use it to just tell people, hey, like, if you're asking a question that could easily be answered by AI, why don't you just go ask AI first? And I think, there was a study that the Journal wrote up recently that there's an emerging gender gap in AI usage, that women are less likely than men to be using AI because they're worried that it's going to make them look like they aren't good at their jobs. And we've just got to kill that across everything. I think generally we encourage people to use the best technology available to them within their organization. This is the best technology available to them. We should encourage people to use it, and we've got to take away any of that stigma. So with that, a very big thank you